Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and such an honor to be part of an excellent group of speakers. Um, Bob, I really enjoyed your talk, but in a way I'm a little bit disappointed because one thing you may not know is that Bob and I have something in common. We're both technophobes, and other than me, Bob's the only person I know um, that doesn't own a cell phone, like a fancy smartphone. And here he is, doing Zoom surveys and recording talks. So you're going to lose your title as a technophobe, Bob. So anyway, back to more serious matters. What I'll talk about today is two studies that we conducted a few years ago that really deal broadly with how people affect fire regimes. And before I go too far, I do want to acknowledge my co-authors. I've been very fortunate to work with very competent and also very creative group of collaborators. And I do want to make a special call out to Sean Parks, who has led the first study that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, well, let's start with some dendrographs. This is something that many of us have seen. It's a story that's been told in much of Western North America. What you have on the horizontal lines is individual trees that have been studied, and the line spans the life of the tree as measured by its rings. And the vertical lines are the fire scars that have been identified for each one of this tree. And this is a study from Tom Swetnam's group. And what does this tell us? This tells us that in the late 19th century, there's a drastic reduction in fire activity in this part of the world. And yeah, it's something we're all too aware of. The suppression of indigenous cultural burning practices, often through law, a change of the landscape, people getting better and more intent on detecting and putting out fires. And it's a story, again, that we've seen over and over in much of the West. Now, if we look at things as they stand today, we've done a study where we looked at, over the last 3 decades, we've compared fire to a number of biophysical variables, climate, but also anthropogenic variables. And if you split the US and Canada in these different kind of big, funny hexagonal cells, on the x-axis, you have what we call the human footprint index. It's kind of a general index of human influence. And on the y-axis is the predicted fire activity. You get pretty much the same story all throughout North America. Where there's more human influence, there's generally fewer fires. And one big exception being California. And this kind of inverse U-shape has been well documented in the past. So this kind of begs the question, are we creating what we've often called a fire paradox? So people are removing fire from the landscape, they're preventing fires from happening, but we might be creating this fire deficit. So we should be getting a lot more fires if we only listen to climate. So just talking about this idea of a fire deficit or a fire surplus, kind of a working definition for now, we'll say it's the degree of departure in fire activity from what would be expected without any human influence. And I do want to emphasize, we're not looking into the past. We're not looking into a baseline that was in the 19th century. We're really looking at what is the fire deficit and surplus in today's environment and conditions. The details, well, it can be positive, that's a fire surplus, or negative, not enough fire from what would be predicted, and that's a fire deficit. The expected fire activity for a given area is predicted only from climate. Again, this is the definition we choose to work with in this work. And this does assume that there is a strong climate between fire. There is a strong relationship between fire and climate. But kind of looking a little bit back at some of the work that was led by Sean Parks, what we did there is that in these plots on the x-axis, you have the percentage of protected areas, both wildernesses and national parks in the Western US. And on the y-axis is the model performance of a model between area burn predicted with climate variables. So in this case, you've got evapotranspiration, you've also got water deficit. And what these graphs show you is that the more protected areas you have, the better the performance. So, and there is a reasonably strong relationship in these areas of low human influence. And this relationship is really decoupled when you've got high human influence. So we do want to focus our modeling efforts on these areas where you've got a strong fire-climate relationship. So what did we do in our study? Well, first of all, we partitioned the US into cells, hexagonal cells that we called hexels. And we extracted these hexels that had at least 75% protected areas, and also a human footprint, so the index I showed earlier, that was less or equal to 1.5, so very little human influence here. We built these models where we predicted expected area burns from this subset of hexels, but we predicted it to the entire Western US. And we've done this for fire and climate data, average from 1984 to 2012. We used 10 climate variables to get all these different aspects of climate describing energy and moisture availability. And what we did is on an eco-region level, we compared the expected to observed values in area burned to infer departures in fire activity. That is to get to this idea of surplus and deficit. We're jumping straight into some results here, and I realize this figure is a bit of a mouthful, but what you see in blue is the fire deficit. What you see in warm colors is the fire surplus. And excuse me. And in the inset on the right there, these gray areas are the forest areas of the Western US. And you can see that where almost all of these areas of high fire deficit occur is in forested areas. And every ecoregion has its own story to tell. Probably every hexel has its own story to tell. But it's important to look at these kinds of data on a really broad level, because this is modeling, and as Bob said, it doesn't tell us the truth, but it does provide some really interesting insights. Kind of zooming in on these areas of fire surplus. Well, you can see here that where you've got the most of the red areas, if you compare that to the cheatgrass distribution, there's a pretty darn good spatial correspondence there. And these annual grasses that have invaded parts of Western North America have very much altered fire regimes. And what you see at the bottom there on the left-hand side graph is that little hotspot is another kind of brome. I believe it is red brome. And yeah, and this has led to some pretty sad ecological situations. I'm a huge fan of deserts. And when you see scenes like this, kind of plants like the Joshua tree that have never co-evolved with a strong fire regime, and these areas that have been invaded by these annual grasses, where you've got fires that kill these fire-sensitive plants, it really does degrade the environment. So take-home message on this first study. Most forested regions continue to experience less fire than expected, according to our results. This might have changed a little bit. Fire surpluses tend to occur in non-forested areas as a result of degradation, but sometimes also contributing to ecological degradation. So our results provide further support for the need for large-scale adaptation and mitigation strategies. And finally, it's interesting to point out that we did do this almost 10 years ago now, so it would be really interesting to compare our result to the fires of the recent years. Okay. Jumping into another study that we published last year, I'm really interested in boreal ecology. I live close to the boreal forest and grew up in the boreal forest. And we wanted to look at this idea of fire deficit around communities of the boreal forest. We've been fighting fires, detecting and fighting fires around many towns in the boreal biome. And again, it kind of begs the question, if we're getting real good at putting out these fires, are we perhaps pushing back a problem or creating a bigger problem? When you think about some of the boreal fires, you often see these kinds of pictures and just incredible fire behavior and these large fires that create their own weather. And you kind of wonder, is it even possible that the fuels, these bottom-up controls, can really affect subsequent fire behavior? And I would claim that, yeah, there are very strong bottom-up controls in the boreal forest. And I'd like to talk about for a second the 2014 fire season in the Northwest Territories. That was an incredible fire season. The area of Belgium burned in the Northwest Territories alone. And what you've got here is in gray, the fires of the last 25 years, and in pink, the fires of 2014, and in dark pink, it's the overlap between past fires and the 2014 fires. And you don't need a real fancy model to tell you that these large fires in 2014 burned in areas that hadn't burned for a while. Now there was 2015. Although it seemed impossible, it was probably even drier in 2015 than in 2014. And there was a whole bunch of fire ignitions. And if you look at those fires outlined in red, these 2015 fires were very much constrained by the fires that had burned the previous year and the past 25 years. Had it not been for those past fires, you would have had lots and lots of very large fires in 2015 in the Northwest Territories. Now, what we'd like to look at here is this forest age around communities. And the goal is to investigate the potential flammability of forest cover surrounding communities with this idea that we've been putting out fires around communities preferentially in the boreal forest. So we're putting a lot more suppression effort where the people are. There's this concept of recently burned forest. It's been kind of shown throughout the literature that 30 years is about the threshold across boreal Canada for this this age effect, where these fires don't reburn as easily for about 30 years after burning. Methods are really simple. What we want to do is we want to look at the proportion of recently burned forest in 25-kilometer radius around communities versus the proportion of recently burned forest in the entire fire regime zones. What are these communities? So we've selected 160 communities in the boreal biome of Canada. And remember those 4 case studies, we will come back to them. We've compared these 160 communities to fires within these fire regime zones. So these are zones that are, you see, they can be disconnected, disjointed, but they do describe fairly homogeneous fire regimes within boreal Canada. And if we jump straight into some results here, I'm going to break this down a bit. These results are stratified by zone. What you have on the x-axis for each one of these panels is the distance from the community, split by 5-kilometer donuts, if you will. And what you have on the y-axis is the percent of recently burned forest. The red line is the average for the zone. So it's the average percentage of recently burned forest for that zone. And as you can, and the point and whiskers are the data for the communities. So as you can see in most zones, the recently burned forests, although it's very, very variable, are below the average percentage of recently burned forest for the zone. So these forests are in fact, according to our definition, older on average, closer to the towns than what would be expected for the zone. Just kind of breaking it down a little bit for a few zones, looking at zone 3 and zone 8, so kind of like north central Canada. These are zones where there's not a whole lot of fire suppression, not a whole lot of fire management. And as you can see, that reduction in recently burned forest, if you look at those plots on the right, are really quite close to the town, 5 to 10 kilometers from the town. So it's concentrated close to the towns. I'd like to put that in contrast with some couple of other zones, zones 5 and zones 11, where a lot of these towns, there's a lot of fire management. There's initial attack bases, and we fight fires a bit more aggressively on average. And you can see that effect in the reduction of recently burned forest really extends away from the town for 25 kilometers and even more on average for a lot of for these zones. So this is all pretty speculative at this point. We haven't really formally examined this, but it's kind of fun to look at and kind of wonder, you know, what is going on with this zone? What's going on with these towns? And it requires a lot more investigation, but I do think there's probably something happening here. So geographically, there's a lot of variation in this phenomenon. Now, if you look at individual towns, and what you've got in red here are these, you're in a situation of fire deficit, and the cool colors is a situation of fire surplus. You can see that there's a lot more warm colors than cool colors, but it does vary a whole lot across Canada and within these zones. And that's something to be expected. Every town has a different geographical context, at a different, it might be in a different fire regime, there's different land use. So we do want to stress that there is a lot of site specificity to these results. Now, why does this matter? Well, I'd like to talk about the Fort McMurray fire of Alberta in 2016. And this is a fire that really marked the imagination of Canadians because, well, it was terrible, but it was the most costly modern natural disaster in Canadian history, at least in terms of, if you measure it in terms of insured losses. And it did actually affect our national economy for a few months. And what's interesting about Fort McMurray is that this is an area, it's one of the bigger towns in the boreal forest of Canada. And we've been fighting fires there quite aggressively for decades. And around the town, in the large area around the town, it was pretty old boreal forest. And there was really old stands that were affected by insect outbreaks or diseased stands. And when this fire burned, it burned very intensely, but it was also a huge fire. It burnt all the way into Saskatchewan. Now, if you look at towns like Fort McMurray and other these are case studies, cherry picked, if you will. But if you look at a few towns in Canada where there has been evacuations in recent years, you see that the pre-fire recently burned forests in these towns was very low. So these towns were in fact in a situation of a strong fire deficit before these large fires burned. And on the top right here, you see the Fort McMurray fire. There wasn't for a landscape that burns as much as this part of the country, there wasn't a whole lot of fire around Fort McMurray when that fire burned. Is it just luck? Maybe. So it needs to be examined a little bit more formally. But I would suggest that there's probably a story to tell here in terms of a human-caused fire deficit. Now there's the whole deal with ignitions. These towns, maybe they have greater fire suppression resources, and maybe we're really good at detecting and fighting these fires around these towns. But they also, if you just look at the number of ignitions, they have a much greater ignition potential than farther away in the zone. And for example, the density of ignitions is 22 times higher within 5% of communities than farther away from these communities, and 62 times higher for human-caused ignitions. So the potential to ignite fires around communities is really quite high. So take-home messages on this second study. Decades of fire suppression likely resulted in a fire deficit around many communities in the boreal forest. And suppression activities can offset this increased fire likelihood, but until they don't, right? And coming back to that Fort McMurray story, like there was a lot of, we fought that fire pretty hard, but what happened. There's a lot of uncertainty regarding the future. This negative feedback between fire and fuels, where you've had a fire and you've got some level of protection for about 30 years, it's less likely that it'll reburn. Will that break down in the future when you perhaps have much more extreme fire weather? Excuse me. We don't really know that, or at least we don't know the entire story just yet. And results such as these ones does offer a possibility to prioritize mitigation action. But I do want to stress that these communities are extremely case specific, and you want to really think long and hard about the needs of individual communities before making management decisions. Well, that's it for me. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope we have a few minutes for questions.
Absolutely, you do. Thank you so much, Mark. That was really fascinating and really boring to revisit photos from some of those catastrophic fires that happened just a couple of years ago. I'd love to open it up for questions. I'm not sure if anyone has their hand raised. I'll check right now, but you can also just drop your questions into the chat. So far, I'm not seeing any hands raised. I'm going to check one more time, and then, oh, great. Beta Wright is wondering, because she's delighted to see your citation for the 2020 paper. She's wondering if Sean Parks also has something new to share.
Well, maybe I'll let Sean respond to
and
this.
he says not right now. I guess I have here we go from Emily. So the 30 years of protection of the boreal forest, is it the same in the montane forest, or is the timeline different?
Well, I guess it depends where you are. if you look at a place, I live in Alberta, and if you look at towns like Banff and Jasper, there's been very well documented by Cliff White and other people at Parks Canada and other organizations. There's been a really, how can I put this? Very strong protection of some parts of these parks where there's been a really interesting history that spans over 100 years of fire protection. And of course, things got a little bit more effective as the technology changed. But still, Cliff has reported some really interesting phenomena that happened in the turn of the last century that have consequences all the way into the 21st century in terms of fire suppression and fire suppression effects. So I would say extremely variable. I can't speak in the first person about the US side of the border, but because it's a lot easier to talk about the more contemporary period and the last 3 decades than go way back in time where you were in a different climate, in very different fire suppression systems. We really focused on the last few decades.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Dinyar Minoshe, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you believe fire smart efforts have the potential to bring back a balance, or would prescribed fires or less suppression be the primary way forward, in your opinion?
Well, I think that you want to use every tool in the toolbox, and we're seeing some of this kind of diversity in the use of tools in Western Canada. And I mean, in a way, it's not rocket science. If you remove some of the fuels, some of the dangerous fuels, you will have a change in fire behavior, fire likelihood and fire behavior. So fire smart practices, fire smart strategies can be extremely effective. But I guess where it makes sense, you should never discount other powerful tools like prescribed burning. And I realize that, again, kind of going to the Banff National Park examples, there's not a lot of appetite, and it can be quite dangerous to try to put real large prescribed burns on the landscape. But when you do piecemeal and you do many small burns over not so many years, it can have the same intended consequence. So it's a bit of a success story that way.
Great, thank you. And then Kira was wondering, do you expect the same pattern of fire deficits occurring in the subboreal forests of Canada? And how do you think that pattern plays out in intensively managed forests outside of the boreal?
Yeah, well, there you have also a strong effect of fire management. So there's a lot of cut blocks, there's a lot of plantations that you'd have to plug into this equation. And in the southern fringe of the boreal forest, there's also just such a strong human presence, and there's the interface with agriculture. So again, it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, that you can't really compare all of these communities collectively. You have to often kind of dig in and look at one specific community and how does it compare, and what kind of like what kind of geographical context is it in, what kind of fire regime is it in, and what's the land use around there, what's the fire, what are the fire suppression capabilities. So I would expect something similar, but again, if you're in a zone where you've got mainly trembling aspen growing, this age effect may not just be as strong as you would have in the northern boreal forest in really strongly coniferous landscapes.
And then Natasha has asked, how can you integrate patterns of fuel treatment around communities in this analysis? Has that work been done? So treated versus recently burned.
Yeah, so this is a really broad brush analysis. You know, when you do these analyses that are subcontinental in scope, obviously you can't really factor in a lot of the detail that is often really, really important for a given community. So unfortunately, in a way, some of that was probably washed out in our analysis, and it would be very interesting to maybe not have as many communities, but really drill down to specific communities and consider kind of the idiosyncrasies, consider the fuel treatments and the very specialized land use, and perhaps things like phenology and what really drives the fire potential as it interfaces with human land use in these communities.